For best practices, I'm going to follow the article which is posted by W3 School. I think this is a pretty good article to go through for the best practices. So the first one that they're mentioning is to avoid global variables. Always declare variables locally. That means do not declare variables and use them across your application. That could keep the variables in the memory for the longer. It could create confusion for new developers who are reading the code. So use variables locally. That means use variables for your if block or switch statements or for loop or a function. Do not declare all of your variables on top of your program and use them across the program. Always declare variables on top of your program. That means if you're declaring variables, declare them when you start writing your program, so that people who are reading your program, they know that they're dealing with these variables in the logic. If you declare variable in between the logic, then it creates confusion for people who are reading the program, and it's cleaner to read this program. Now I know that this program uses first name, last name, price, discount, full price. So these are the variables which will be used in this program. So it's easier to read and it's easier to understand the program. And that goes for the for loops too. If you're using while loop or for loop, declare your counter on top of the loop and then use that counter in your for or while loop. Always initialize variables. If you're just declaring variable, that means you're not defining your variable. When you use that variable in your program, you could run into undefined exceptions. You could run into those errors. So whenever you declare variable, that itself just declare, also assign value to it. That way JavaScript knows that, okay, this is a string, this is a number, this is an array, this is an object. So JavaScript knows what it's dealing with instead of not what is the data type of that variable. You could run into problems if you're not defining your variables. Never declare variables like numbers, strings, and booleans. So there are different ways you can declare your variables. If you're using string, you can either assign your x like this, or you can also assign your y as string by using new keyword. And just like we created objects, we are creating a string here, but they say that do not do that because that could make your execution speed slower, and there are some comparison issues that you could run into. So if you're not using new object, then what you should be using is these things. Like if you're creating a new object, use two curly braces. If you're creating a string, use double quotes. If you're creating a number, use 0, boolean, false, true, and you can follow these patterns for creating variables. Always be aware of automatic type conversion. JavaScript is loosely typed. This is one of the drawbacks of JavaScript. Other programming languages, they tend to manage types properly, but JavaScript is loosely typed, which is kind of a curse. It gives you a freedom while programming JavaScript. It makes it easier to program in JavaScript, but it's also a curse because if you can declare a variable as a string, and then in your logic you can change that to number too, and it is confusing for people to read it. And also you could go later in your program thinking that x is a string and try to use it as a string, and that could cause problems in your program. So they're giving some examples here, like if you're adding 5 plus 7, this will give you 12, but if you're adding 5 plus string of 7, then this will give you 57. So beware of how arithmetic operations are working too when you're working with strings and numbers. So for strings, plus could be used as concatenation, but for arithmetic operations, for numbers, it uses as addition. So just make sure that you're using numbers when you're using arithmetic operations, and when you're concatenating, you're just using strings. You can't subtract strings. This will give you not a number, so don't subtract strings from strings. Use comparison operator this is strict comparison. We talked about this in one of the episodes, one of the lectures in this tutorial. Always use this because it checks the value and the type of the variable. It does not just check the value. So, if you compare number with string, this one is equal to string of one, and that returns true, and this can cause problems. So always use this 3 equal to for strict comparison. That way you know that the data type does not match even if the value is matching for these two variables. So always try to use strict comparison in your program. Parameter defaults, these are if you're using a function. In function, if you are not passing x and y, it will throw an error, but there is no way for my function to know what the data type of this x and y is. So in ECMAScript 2015, you can pass it as, you can pass default value to your variables which are getting passed in function. That way you know that the data type of A is a number and B is number 2. And your switch statements with defaults. So we talked about switch statements in one of the lessons. Switch statements, you write cases for it, but if none of the cases are satisfied in your program, then nothing will happen. So always write default statements so that something will happen, and as a programmer that at least the default statement is getting executed in the switch statement. Avoid using eval. Eval is something that we did not talk in this tutorial, but eval evaluates an expression. If you pass an expression into this function and pass values to it, then it will evaluate that expression and will give you the return. It will return the result back, but it does have some security issues, so avoid using it. Write your own logic while you're evaluating expressions. So that's all about best practices. And with this, I'm going to end this tutorial. And in the next section, I'm going to just make a thank you slide so that you can follow me on Twitter and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.